Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. "72 years ago, in the aftermath of World War II, the Menzies government signed the ANZUS agreement with the United States. ANZUS has provided the bedrock of Australia's defence and strategic posture ever since. Australia's relationship with the United States grew out of our shared sacrifices in World War II, where the citizens of the two countries first began to really get to know one another. Joining me to discuss a fascinating story that shapes not just that period, but the relations between the United States and Australia is author and former Senator Brett Mason. Welcome to Afternoon Light, Brett.
Hi, thanks for having me, Georgina. Thank you.
It's a pleasure, and we're here to talk about your new book, Saving Lieutenant Kennedy, the heroic story of the Australian who helped rescue JFK, which I have read almost all. And it is, I think Kim Beazley says it's a story written with great flair, a must read. I agree. I have loved this book. I am not normally partial to military history. And I must say, I have changed my mind.
Thank you, Georgia.
It's very engaging.
That's very generous. I appreciate it. Thank you.
But tell me, Brett, why did you decide to write this story about Lieutenant Kennedy's rescue during World War II?
Georgina, years ago, I had heard about Reg Evans, and I knew he had helped rescue.
And we should say Reg Evans is the coast watcher who saves Lieutenant Kennedy.
Yeah, a coast watcher. He was stationed in the Solomon Islands during the Second World War, and along with Solomon Islander scouts, in the end, of course, saves Lieutenant Kennedy and Kennedy's crew. I knew about Reg Evans, and the truth is that events forced me to do it very, very quickly. So it's the 80th anniversary this year since Evans helped rescue JFK and his crew. It is, of course, 60 years ago this November since, of course, President Kennedy's death. And also President Kennedy's daughter, Caroline Kennedy, of course, now is US Ambassador to Australia. And so I had to write this book, and I wrote it fairly quickly, but I hope it's enjoyable to read. It was certainly enjoyable to write.
Well, and I saw the other day that Ambassador Kennedy and her son actually reenacted the swim that her father had undertaken to seek help, didn't he, when he was stranded on a sort of remote Solomon Island?
That's right. It's actually potentially quite hazardous, principally these days, not because of still fighting the Japanese, of course, obviously, but the wildlife can be fairly hazardous there.
Yes.
You got to be a bit careful, but you're quite right.
Sharks and barracudas, I read.
That's right.
Yes, nasty. So just paint a picture for me and our listeners, Brett, about how Lieutenant Kennedy gets to the Solomon Islands and into a situation where he needs rescuing, because we know him, of course, as the glamorous president of the United States with a beautiful wife and a fairy tale story, and obviously a life cut tragically short with his assassination in November 1963. But he had a storied military history and
he did.
And actually quite a fascinating life in the lead up to that too.
Quite right, Georgina. It's fair to say that President Kennedy, Jack Kennedy, as he was universally known, he was a war hero, a legitimate one, a fair income war hero. How he ended up in the Solomon Islands is interesting. He had a lifelong love affair with the sea, with yachts and sailing, and his choice of, when war eventuated after Pearl Harbor in December 1941, his choice of service was naturally enough the United States Navy. But first of all, he tried for the Army, he was rejected, tried for the Navy then, was rejected, and after doing more calisthenics, he always had health problems. Kennedy with his back and with his intestinal problems. He's finally got into the United States Navy. It was interesting. He was offered a job in Washington, D.C. in intelligence. And he was the perfect guy for that. He was educated. He travelled a lot. He had great family connections, as your listeners would be aware. And in a sense, he was built for that, Jack Kennedy, but he wanted to see action. And he didn't need to. He could quite legitimately done his job in Washington throughout the Second World War. He sought action, and he had to plead to his parents and to political contacts to finally be given a chance to fight in combat. And of course, that was to command a PT boat, a patrol torpedo boat in the Solomon Islands. So he arrives there in the middle of 1943. In fact, when he arrived, the Japanese were bombing his boat that he arrived in the Solomons on. So he got one hell of a welcome. A few weeks of quiet. And then in August of 1943, 80 years ago this year, he was sent out along with 15 other PT boats to patrol on the west coast of the Kolombangara Island, where the Japanese destroyers and Japanese transport ships brought down men and materiel to their bases. And what the PT boats were supposed to do was to disrupt that, what they called the Tokyo Express.
Yeah.
And it was just to disrupt that. And that night, the 1st of August 1943, it was a shambles, basically. All of the PT boats went out. The 4 boats that had radar shot their torpedoes to no avail and then went home back to base. Kennedy was left out in Blackett Strait with 2 other PT boats, lost contact. And at about 2:30 in the morning on the 2nd of August 1943, out of the mist and the gloom and the dark comes a Japanese destroyer weighing over 2,000 tonnes, about 125 metres long, and smashed into a 25-metre, 50-tonne PT boat. So it's like a truck hitting a billy cart, and broke it in two and smashed it, and it exploded with all the aviation fuel on board for the engines. And everyone assumed that Kennedy and his crew had all been killed. The PT boats thought that, and so did the Japanese on the destroyer. They thought that everyone was dead, but they weren't.
No, indeed. And of course, this then brings us to his interaction with Reg. But I think it'd be interesting for you to explain about these PT boats, because you write about this, how they were much loved, but they were sort of completely hopeless.
Yes.
But Kennedy really loved his PT boat, didn't he? Yeah.
They were very romantic.
Yes.
Because PT boats had helped General MacArthur escape from the Philippines, ultimately back to Australia. And there was a romance about these wooden-hulled, mahogany-hulled boats that young men loved. And everyone wanted to be a commander of them. And the competition was intense to become a commander of a PT boat. But as I was saying, the problem was the torpedoes didn't work, or hardly ever worked. And there's hardly ever a recorded case of them ever doing any damage except to each other. So they were a glamorous craft, but not very useful. And in time, of course, they had to be upscaled and superior armaments fitted and so forth. And they became a bit more useful. They became gunboats. But they were romantic, useful only, they used to say, for raising war bonds.
Yes, well, at least they had some use. So we're talking about the Pacific theatres of war. Of course, the United States having entered World War II later than Australia and Britain, and that particularly with the tragedy at Pearl Harbor. But then, the Pacific does become, and particularly the South Pacific and New Guinea, become such an extremely serious theatre of war for Australians. And you see the rise of the Coast Watcher,
yes,
which is, I think, a position, sort of a quasi-military position that I don't think many people know about. But, of course, this was a time when we didn't have satellites and good military communication, so we had to rely on a lot of eyes and ears and bits of paper and messengers. And you see these Australians being deployed all around the Pacific in this role. Can you tell me about what Coast Watchers were doing? And, of course, the famous Coast Watcher in this case, Reg Evans.
Reg Evans, indeed. Yeah. Georgina, before drones and satellites, we had Coast Watchers, and they were, in effect, intelligence officers.
Yeah.
And there were about, between 400 and 600 of them throughout the Second World War, stationed on islands in the Pacific archipelago. And their job, initially at least, was to sit like a spider in the web, as Reg Evans later wrote, and simply report on the activity of the Japanese, both the movement of troops and materiel, and supplying and so forth. So they spied on the Japanese, in effect, to find out what they were up to. It was a difficult job. It was behind enemy lines. And there's a quote from Commander Eric Felt, who established the Coast Watchers before the Second World War, or reinvigorated them before the Second World War. And he said, as a Coast Watcher, I can only promise you the promise of extreme peril. If you are caught, yes, you'd be killed, but you'd be tortured first. And dozens were. And Reg Evans knew that. But he and others who had worked, as Evans had, he'd worked in the Pacific, as you know, from the late 1920s when he was just a young man. So he knew the islands, knew the people, knew the language. So he was a perfect recruit into the Coast Watcher system. And, well, in the end, he makes one particular rescue that changes, well, American history certainly, but probably world history. But they were so critical, as you point out in your question, particularly in Guadalcanal, Australian coast watchers based on Bougainville that alerted the Americans to the Japanese bombers leaving Rabaul and coming down to Guadalcanal that bombed the American bases. And they gave the Americans about 2 hours' notice by reporting, by relay actually, relay to Port Moresby, Townsville, Canberra, Pearl Harbor, finally back to Guadalcanal. But it gave 2 hours for the Americans to get ready for the arrival of the Japanese bombers. And Admiral William Halsey said that the Coast Watchers saved Guadalcanal and Guadalcanal saved the South Pacific. So it's quite a big call.
And potentially Australia. And, of course, it wasn't just the Australian Coast Watchers who were important. It was the scouts who were local islanders, Solomon Islanders. And, I mean, it's interesting in your book you write about, I mean, of course, the Coast Watchers were taking huge risks in these jobs. And if they got caught, it was absolute curtains and potentially a very agonising death too. But the scouts were putting even more on the line, weren't they? Because their families, they were living in their communities. So potentially if they were caught, it wasn't just them who would get
Dead right.
Executed. It was the entire family.
That's right. Well, the village, and it's like the partisans in Europe during the Second World War.
Yeah.
They didn't just kill you. They killed your family or the village, or they took out reprisals against others. So you're right. Reg, if he'd been caught, no doubt would have been killed. But if the scouts had been caught, their families were killed as well. So they really were taking a big risk, the scouts. And there's not one case in the Solomon Islands of the scouts ever betraying the trust of Australian or indeed Allied Coast Watchers or members of the military service of the United States or Australia, ever. Not once.
That's amazing. Can you tell me a bit about Reg Evans before? I mean, you've alluded to it. He'd worked in the South Pacific before becoming a Coast Watcher, but he's a very different figure from Jack Kennedy, isn't he? I mean, they couldn't have been more different.
He's very, very different than Jack Kennedy. He's described, one of the people that wrote this lovely endorsement for the book described him as the laconic Australian. I thought he isn't a laconic Australian, but he's sort of the iconic Australian as well. He's a man of few words, born in 1905, working class family in Leichhardt. Father was a public servant. Reg was quite well educated, sought to go into the Royal Australian Navy, didn't get in. But then in the 1920s, as a young man, Burns Philp opened tourism in the South Pacific, tourism and also cocoa trade and copra and so forth. And Reg was always in love with the sea. So he went to the New Hebrides, which is today Vanuatu. And it run in those days, they call it a condominium between the United Kingdom and France. But it was popularly described as a pandemonium because of such a shambolic government. However, he worked there but had to return to Australia because of the Great Depression in the late 20s, early 30s. But he kept a lifelong love of the sea and also a lifelong love of the Pacific Islands. With Jack Kennedy, on the other hand, well, he came from a striving Irish family, comfortable at one level, but competitive and tense nonetheless. I'm not sure it would have been comfortable being a Kennedy always, frankly. I think it was a pretty tough upbringing at one level, a very competitive life. But he went to great schools, finished at Co-8, a great prep school in Connecticut in the United States, and had such a personality even then as a teenager. He was considered most likely to succeed in what no one knew, but he was likely to succeed in something. Great personality, Jack Kennedy. And everyone who's ever met him says, he had a lovely smile and he was great fun. Both men and women thought that.
He was sort of a born leader, wasn't he? Reg was, I mean, you describe him as quite diminutive, a quieter, taciturn person. But they both had a love of adventure, didn't they? They both wanted to be on the water and out in the sea. And
they shared that, Georgina.
Yes.
They did share a love of the sea. Different personalities. Yeah, you're quite right. He was a shyer. He was only about 5'4", Reg Evans, Kennedy's 6'1" or something. He's a small bloke, but with a lovely smile. He had a thin face, but a lovely smile, Reg Evans. And he had something, He married very well, the daughter of a judge of the Supreme Court of South Australia, Gertrude Slaney Poole. He had something. He was a guy who was quite self-assured in his own way. And that came out, obviously, as a coast watcher when he was in the Solomons.
Prior to World War II, Australia and America hadn't had much to do with each other, had they? I mean, you write about this. They sort of almost had no contact, and the population sort of could have almost not known the other existed. And it's quite sort of curious to read about that but for World War II, Australia and America might otherwise have had quite a separate existence. But how was that sort of first meeting of the two countries?
It's a good question, actually, because I assumed there'd been more contact between Australia and the United States before the Second World War. There was actually very little. I mean, there's a little bit of symmetry to the development. Arthur Phillip leaving Portsmouth a day before the Constitutional Convention commenced. The debates commenced in Philadelphia in the United States. There wasn't the United States then, but when they were first developing the Constitution. And by the time he arrived in Sydney, there were several signatories to the Constitution. And by the time the Second Fleet arrived, 13 states had signed up. So there's a certain symmetry, but the truth is Australia was initially populated by convicts and the military. It took a while before free settlers arrived. The United States was different. It attracted dissidents and people seeking political and religious freedom. Australia wasn't like that. We forced certain people to come here, as you know. It was a different culture.
Yes.
There was some interaction during our respective gold rushes. Some Aussies went to California and weren't very welcome because they behaved so badly. Some of the Americans came back, of course, for the Ballarat Bendigo gold rushes in the 1850s. But they didn't stay. Bit of contact during the First World War, the Battle of Hamel, when with General Monash leading the charge. But again, not much. And then virtually nothing until just before the Second World War, where the truth is that the security threat from Japan forced Australia and the United States together, a shotgun marriage, really. And just prior to the war, the Americans did arrive and did some just before the war, early scouting around for air bases in northern Australia, just in case Japan attacked the Philippines. Why? Because they would attack back from Australia. And they knew that, even in the late 1930s. So, but, really, there was no air service, no submarine cable. We had imperial preferences in trading, which annoyed the United States, of course. The Americans were also protectionist, and they were isolationist in their foreign policy with a mode of the Pacific and the Atlantic.
And it's interesting on the isolationism, which is a real feature of US foreign policy. It sort of ebbs and flows, of course, over the generations and different presidents. But Jack Kennedy's father, who'd been an ambassador, I think was it to the UK, American ambassador to the UK, he was a staunch isolationist, wasn't he? And then his son, his second son, Jack, he's studying in his university thinking, I'm not satisfied with this. I think America can give more to the world. And he really went against his father, and he wrote a best-selling book about how the United States should play a much more active role in democracy around the world and standing up for liberal values.
That's right. It wasn't unusual to be an isolationist, was it, in the United States? The Republican Party generally was isolationist before the Second World War. Many famous Americans were, Charles Lindbergh, very much against being involved in another bloody European war. And in a sense, you can understand that.
Sure.
But Jack Kennedy thought, you're quite right, he wrote a best-selling book based on his honours thesis at Harvard, that it wasn't only the right thing to do to protect democracy against totalitarian powers in Europe, but it was in America's interests to do it. That it suited America to become a protector of democracy. It was good for America and good for the world, because it was the beginning of the move from America being a continental power to a global power.
It's interesting in your book you write about the influx of 1 million Americans into Australia during the war, when Australia's population was just 7 million. And the instruction manual that American soldiers are given before they enter Australia, and how, was saying something like a meat pie is like a hot dog, and cricket, the Australians like to play cricket. It's a really boring game.
But it's boring, that's right.
But I thought the interesting assessment of the Australian character that Americans, they like to do well, but if they want to do well, they work hard to get what they want, to receive the rewards of their work, whereas the American assessment of Australians is they're pretty laid back and expect the state to provide, which goes against a bit of, I think, our national storytelling to ourselves. But it was interesting in the 1940s, that was what the Americans observed of Australians.
That's right. I think one of the quotes in the book is from a young American serviceman who said, "Oh, the Aussies, I like the Aussies, but all they want to do is sit around drinking tea all day." That they didn't want to work too hard. I think if that was true, it's not so true now. I mean, no one would say Australians don't work hard. When I was growing up in the 70s, people still said that. We didn't work hard. But no one would say that anymore. Australians work hard. And having worked in Europe for a few years, I think Australians can count themselves among the world's hardest working people. But certainly back then, as you say, with the influx of 1 million Americans into a country of 7 million, it changed the way we thought about ourselves. In a sense, it gave us a model for the future. This was a truly multi-ethnic country. We were British. Mm. Now, some of your listeners might think, well, we were, and the census will detail that, but about 97% of the country looked just like me, or 98% of the country. And we thought of ourselves as British. It didn't matter if it was Alfred Deakin saying that or John Curtin. We were British. The Americans arrived and they looked different, far more diverse. They had Scandinavians, they had Poles, Germans, Italians, and the rest. And that diversity was a bit of a shock for Australia. But also the dynamism and their can-do attitude, it sort of shocked a rather staid Australia. And Georgina, I remember my grandmother, my mother's mother, who lived in Brisbane during the war, telling me that the Americans, they looked different. They were sort of cleaner cut, better uniforms, more money, more handsome, she said. I don't know how true that was, but more handsome. And yes, more diverse. She thought that too. They weren't all Anglo-Irish. It did force Australia to look at ourselves anew, I think.
And they were better paid too.
They certainly were, yes.
Their soldiers, their officers were much better paid than their Australian counterparts. And that made for some difficult moments, didn't it? And some sort of jealousies, and the fact that the American soldiers could take out the Australian ladies and entertain them to a much higher standard than their Australian soldiers could.
That's right. And it was quite a bit. I think it was 2 or sometimes 3 times as much they were paid. So they had access to stocking, cigarettes, grog and the rest that the Aussies really didn't. Better cut uniforms. My grandmother was right. And there was often tension, not so much between Australian civilians and American servicemen, between Australian and American servicemen. The Battle of Brisbane, about this happened every now and then, not just in Australia but elsewhere.
Yeah, so this was where Australian soldiers and American soldiers got into a massive brawl in Brisbane.
Yes. In fact, I've been to where it happened. In fact, it's strange because the American PX and the Australian PX, Postal Exchange, were just within about 150 yards of each other, just around the corner. And, of course, they're both drinking. It was on Thanksgiving night, and Americans are drinking to celebrate Thanksgiving. The Australians are drinking because they were drinking.
We're Australian.
And, and of course it was the United States that the military police got involved. And anyway, it became a huge brawl, which was largely covered up because it was in no one's interests, of course, that any dissension between Australian and American troops that became public knowledge, although my grandmother said everyone knew what had happened, but they were so grateful to the Americans that they would put up with it. Civilians just were so grateful. I must say this, Georgina, people forget this, that this is March 1941. So this is before Pearl Harbor. Mm-hmm. America is still neutral, but Australia is at war fighting in North Africa and also in Greece and shortly in Greece and Crete in Europe. But we're scared, of course, of Japan. An American naval squadron under Admiral Newton dropped by and several ships, and they berthed in the Brisbane River. I can see where they berthed just outside my window in my apartment in Brisbane. And more people, as a percentage of the population, turned up to see those American servicemen walk Ann Street through the valley into the City Hall on any other occasion in Australian history, something like, more than 90% of the city's population, people were petrified of Japan. And the fact that the Americans had arrived, and they were still neutral in America, just showed how desperate Australia was. So we shouldn't forget that Australian people were scared, and how easy it is to forget that for that period, even before Pearl Harbor. But for a couple of years, we were really very scared.
And of course, Robert Menzies, who was Prime Minister at that stage, was imploring Winston Churchill, British Prime Minister, to take the threat to Australia from Japan much more seriously. And there were concerns that Australia was left very exposed because our soldiers were off, as you say, in the Middle East, in Greece and Crete, not defending Australian territory. And then, of course, with the fall of Singapore in February 42 and bombing of Darwin, the reality is totally brought home and all our worst fears were realised. And you write about this, that sense that we saw Americans, not the British. We've turned to America and looked to America, as John Curtin said, who takes over as Prime Minister after Menzies resigned. But he says we look to America because Britain wasn't there. Britain has to fight its own war and in its own theatres of war in Europe. And we are now looking to America for assistance to defend our country, to defend our way of life. It's a big mindset change, change really quickly too. And you see, you're describing the population of Australia is also scared and quite quickly looking in the other direction, looking east to America.
You're right that we were shocked but not surprised by the Japanese advance. And what horrified Australians was how rapid the advance was south, as you say, through Hong Kong, Manila, Singapore, and then Rabaul, and then, of course, the bombing of Darwin in February 1942. It happened so quickly that all of a sudden the Japanese are at our doorstep. And you can imagine being an Australian living in Brisbane, or indeed anywhere. It's not an exaggeration to believe that Japanese could be in your backyard in a couple of weeks because they had come all that way very, very quickly. Fortunately, the Americans were on their way, and General MacArthur, of course, arrived not long after, 1942, and he started to build up American forces. But it took a while, Georgina. It took actually a while before the Americans came in any great numbers. But when they did, with the naval battles, of course, and Battle of Coral Sea, of course, was really important, stopping the Japanese Navy getting to Port Moresby. The Japanese army stopped on the Kokoda Track. Australian American troops stopped them. And also, of course, at Milne Bay. Of the three ways, Japanese were hoping to get to Port Moresby, but Australians largely stopped them and the American Navy. But it took really until after the Battle of Midway in June 1942 before Australia could sort of breathe a sigh of relief. But John Curtin didn't believe we were safe until months after that.
No. So we have diverted, of course, from the story of the 1st, 2nd of August, and we've left poor Jack Kennedy in the sea. His PT boat destroyed. They're with 11 other crew, I think it is. And the Japanese think they're dead. The Americans think they're dead. What happens next?
That's right. Poor Jack Kennedy, his officers back at the base start planning a memorial service. So there was 13 on the PT boat. 2 were killed instantly. 11 are left. That's 10 plus Jack Kennedy. They're in the water from about 2:30 a.m. on the 2nd of August. They're holding on to the wreckage, which is obviously still floating. And by about 1 p.m. the next day, or 1:30, what's that? 11 hours later, they're still in the water holding onto the wreckage, but it starts to sink. And they're also worried about the Japanese planes or Japanese Navy picking them up. Kennedy spies a small island and says, "Gentlemen, we're going to have to make that island." And so for the next 4 hours, they swim towards this very small island, Plum Pudding Island, the British called it, and today it's called Kennedy Island. And Kennedy, who was a strong swimmer, he swam for Harvard University, and he grabbed one of the blokes by his life vest with his teeth and breaststroked this injured crewman all the way to the island. It's very brave, extraordinary, and others followed. So all 11 finally got, after about 4.5 hours, got to the island where they could rest. There were a few coconuts, but not much to eat, not much to drink. But at least for the moment, they were safe. So that was about 6 p.m. or so on the 2nd of August.
I mean, can you imagine after all that time, there's basically nothing to drink, nothing to eat. You're feeling pretty desperate. You're in the middle of enemy territory, Japanese planes going over the whole time. What do you do?
Well, you're right. There were thousands of Japanese encamped nearby. And what Kennedy did is he went out, he said, we need some water and I need to all flag down another PT boat or an American craft. It's extraordinary, but this is the energy of youth. He gets to the island after a bit of a rest, decides to go out searching, trying to attract the US Navy. He couldn't do it, but came back later to his crew exhausted, nearly drowned. And it was a couple of days later, as they moved to islands further south, that small islet chain, that they came upon a hidden canoe, some water, and the Japanese candy that was actually a secret stash from the Islander scouts. And then they came around a corner and saw two young Melanesians, Solomon Islanders, inspecting the wreck of a Japanese barge. And they thought, oh, look, let's grab their attention. And they started waving at these two young Melanesians. And the Solomon Islanders saw Jack Kennedy and his crewmate and thought, oh God, who are they? Thinking they were Japanese. And so they paddled off. But as they paddled off away from Kennedy and Barney Ross, who was with him, his crewman, they stopped, fortunately, at the island where the other Americans were to pick up coconuts. And they met the other Americans, and after some difficulty, because the Solomon Islands didn't trust, they just saw white men.
Yeah.
And thought Japanese or German or danger. In the end, there was enough communication and enough pidgin English to explain to the Solomon Islanders they were Americans. And then 2 + 2 = 4. Scouts thought, oh, these must be the missing Americans. So when Jack Kennedy arrives back at the island at about midnight, he sees a fire, and sitting around that fire, smoking cigarettes, are the two Solomon Islanders that he'd seen earlier that day. And that, of course, was the start of the rescue.
Amazing. So at this stage, they are thought to be dead, though, aren't they?
Thought to be dead, yes.
Yeah. So how does he get a message to Reg?
Well, from there...
that's no mean feat. No mobile phones, no drones,
no
satellites.
No WhatsApp back then, no. What happened next was that Jack Kennedy, they needed to write a note to give to either Coast Watchers or indeed the US bases that were miles away. But they needed to write something to tell them that the Americans were alive and they needed help. So they got a coconut, and of course, the famous coconut.
Coconuts are coming in very handy.
They are.
Yeah.
And of course, he famously etched that note and gave it to the...
And this coconut. Remember this coconut.
Yes,
everyone.
it is. Yes. It is kept. The coconut is
Don't
kept.
forget the coconut.
Yes. And the two scouts take the coconut and they stop off also with an invoice. Actually, it was a Burns Philp invoice from the company that Reg Evans worked with before the war. And it was also had a note from Barney Ross on that invoice, plus the coconut. And the two scouts headed off towards...
Lucky they had a pen. Did they have a pen?
Yeah, or a pencil, something.
Oh, pencil, yeah.
Yeah, they did.
Yeah.
And they went off to the US base. But they stopped by and saw other scouts. And they told the scouts. And the other scouts, of course, informed Reg Evans, the Coast Watcher. And they paddled for, 18 hours or something, the two young Melanesians towards the US base. But then the other scouts told Evans, and Evans said, right, first thing next morning, you have to go back to the Americans and bring their commanding officer to see me, and we will plan the rescue. And next morning, Benjamin Kevu, this is when Benjamin Kevu comes into the story, who could speak good English. He was Methodist educated and he had very good English. And he was sent with a note from Reg Evans on OHMS notepaper, I might add, on His Majesty's service, it would have been back then. And Kevu took it to the Americans and arrived. And as the islanders moved towards Kennedy and his crew sitting around on the island, with a flourish, he took out this note and said, "Sir," and gave to Kennedy this OHMS note signed by Reg Evans saying, "Please come back to the island to help plan the rescue of you and your crew." They didn't do it straight away. They had a feast instead. They had a big feast. They're all starving.
Yeah.
And then later that day, hiding under palm fronds in the canoe, Kevu and the others ferried Kennedy back to, by then, Gomu Island, where Reg Evans was stationed. He just moved there the previous night, actually, and he hadn't set up his radio, but he had by this later that day. They ferried him back, and luckily he was hiding because there were actually Japanese spotter planes above looking at them.
Gee.
But he was hiding under the fronds, and late that afternoon, probably around about 6 p.m., Evans can see, looking, ripples starting to occur and a canoe moving towards them. And he's worried because he thought, where's the commander? Where's the white man? And he looked across and he didn't worry because the quote is, Benjamin Kevu's face was wreathed in smiles. So he knew things were going well. And just as they reached the beach, out jumped a skinny, unshaven, bedraggled, exhausted Jack Kennedy and grabbed the hand of Reg Evans and said, boy, am I glad to see you. And then Evans said to him, and I'm bloody glad to see you too. and they went, and of course planned, they went back for a cup of tea and Evans's hideaway and planned the pickup later that night of Jack Kennedy's crew. And of course, late that night, the Americans came up, picked up Jack Kennedy. Kennedy took them back, navigated their ways through the coral, picked up Kennedy's crew, took them back to Rendova, and all of them survived. The 11 that were on the island all survived.
And Reg Evans and Jack Kennedy wouldn't have expected to see each other ever again.
No.
So that could have just been the end of it. I understand that Jack had to take Reg's rifle.
Well, that's right, he did.
And he didn't have many clothes left by this stage, so he had to take some coveralls from him.
Quite right. That's right.
So anyway, Reg was happy to oblige, but
that's right. He gave him you're quite right. He gave him the rifle. He needed that because it needed to have 4 shots to warn the PT boats that
it was a friend, not foe.
Friend, not foe. Quite right.
So, I mean, fast forward to 1961, and well, they do meet again, but there was a lot of confusion, wasn't there? So Jack Kennedy thinks that Reg was, I think, English and then thought he was maybe New Zealand. Well, he originally thought he was English, shouldn't he, because of His Majesty's Service letterhead, and he couldn't Reg's writing properly, so he couldn't actually remember the name of Reg. He thought it was a completely different name. And then he thought Reg was a New Zealander, so really they might never have met again. But for
Georgina, that's right.
An amazing turn of events.
And that was the rise of Jack Kennedy's political career.
Yeah.
You know, if it hadn't been for that, no one would have been particularly interested. But as he became, congressman, senator, presidential hopeful, and then, of course, elected as president of the United States, who was that bloke who rescued President Kennedy, as he then was in August 1943? John Hersey's original article published in New Yorker says it was Lieutenant Wincote from the New Zealand Infantry.
Yeah.
And, of course, there was no Wincote. And Evans knew, because he read that article when it was republished in Reader's Digest in late 1944 back in Australia. I thought it was me. It wasn't a bloody Wincote. It wasn't a New Zealander,
So he knew he knew that Jack Kennedy was the person he'd rescued. Yeah.
Because it was the only one he ever rescued.
Right.
The only one.
Yeah.
It's interesting, isn't it? But he said he kept his mouth shut. He said, because it was no halos and glory stunt. It was another long day and a long war. Why would I buy into that?
Mm.
But in the end, there was so much attention around who rescued Jack Kennedy. And the Pacific Islands Monthly, the small newspaper, then a magazine in Sydney, got hold of the story. And the call went out. Who was it? And Eric Felt, who I mentioned before, Commander Eric Felt, said the person who it would have been in that island at that time would have been a guy called Lieutenant Reg Evans. Wherever he is, he could shed some light. Evans was made aware of it and finally went in to see the Pacific Islands Monthly, and still a long way to go. But in the end, of course, he outed himself and then was outed to the American press as the rescuer of Lieutenant Kennedy. But it took a long time.
And then how did he get to meet the president? I mean, how did this transpire? Because Reg is still in Australia and no doubt the president is pretty occupied.
Well, he became a bit of a celebrity because it took a while to identify him.
So it was a mystery.
It was a mystery.
Yeah.
And it's funny, here we are in the Menzies Institute. When Menzies first met Jack Kennedy in February of 1961, Kennedy said to Menzies, well, Australia's partly responsible for my administration.
Yes.
Because just the next day, Pierre Salinger, who was Kennedy's press secretary, announced that Lieutenant Reg Evans had been identified as the rescuer. So it was what a great icebreaker for Menzies and Kennedy. And from there, President Kennedy invited Reg Evans to the White House to meet on May the 1st, 1961. And he became a bit of a celebrity. He appeared on these crazy evening shows in America and with Betty White, among others. And he appeared on the Jack Paar Show, who was like a precursor to Johnny Carson, the Tonight Show. And he was a very popular figure for a short time in the United States in 1961. And then, of course, returned in 1962 with Benjamin Kevu when Jack Paar did a special on the rescue of PT 109.
Yes, you've got some lovely photos of these meetings in May 61 and, Reg Evans and President Kennedy together in the Oval Office, and then, of course, with Benjamin Kevu in 1962 and the surviving crew of that PT boat, which is wonderful to see these photos. But what of the coconut? Tell me.
Oh, the coconut. Well, of course, that survived. And one author describes as one of the talismans on the road to success that he put on his desk in the Oval Office that was taken by the two, like Kaza, Ironi Kamana and Boyku Kaza, the two original Coast Watchers that saw Kennedy originally, all the way to Rendover. And they took that with them. And Kennedy got the coconut back and the handwritten note from Evans and kept them as reminders of the frailty of human beings and how the difference between life and death can be so narrow. And that reminded him until the end of his days just how lucky you can be and indeed how unlucky you can be.
I mean, it's quite a remarkable story. And as you say, and as President Kennedy said, Australia was responsible for the Kennedy administration, but also Australia contributed to his personal story, that as a war hero and as someone who was so central to the development of the Australia-US relationship.
Absolutely. In fact, Menzies, when President Kennedy was killed, in the eulogies delivered in House of Representatives, Menzies said what set Kennedy apart from his predecessors was his genuine interest in Australia.
Yeah.
And it is true that Kennedy had planned to come originally in 1963 to Australia, and then, of course, it was rescheduled for the Australian spring of 1964. But obviously that didn't happen when he was killed in Dallas. But there's no question that Kennedy was very keen to come here and loved Australia, the America's Cup, of course, in 1962, and made that lovely speech about Australia and Australians being this great nation of 10 million people, that great sportsmen, great soldiers and great allies. So he was very fond of Australia. And in fact, Sir Howard Beale, our ambassador, said that. He was very, very fond of Australia and Australians. So it's a pity he didn't get here.
But his successor did, of course, in Lyndon Johnson. And, of course, Lyndon Johnson, a story for another day, a podcast for another day, had famously been to Australia during World War II when he was a congressman, but on a sort of mission directed by General MacArthur, I think. But there was that strong connection with those later presidents that Menzies had to interact with over his almost 18 years as Prime Minister. Well, Brett, what a fabulous story. Thank you for telling it and writing it and making it once again such a prominent part of the Alliance, because it's a story that I think was very well known back in the day, but of course isn't so well remembered these days, and you're righting that wrong. So great to have you on Afternoon Light to discuss it.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Georgina.
That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.